that's just a little bit of Leanne LaHavis to get us started. Thank you all for joining us. Our session will be recorded. We'll send out the recording after our webinar, but we really appreciate you all joining us for creating a liberatory work experience. We'll be sharing some ideas about how you can infuse liberation across the employee life cycle. My name is Alli, and I'm one of the co-founders of the Equity Practice. Whenever we share space with other people, we begin with a land acknowledgement, and I'm going to do that again today. We do this because some of my Indigenous peers have asked me to do that. And they asked me to do that because often people don't remember that they are still here. And so this acknowledgement is about remembering the harm that happened to them as they came to be. I am coming to you as from the land of the Tawakani, Wichita, Kickapoo, and Jumanos people here in a place called Dallas, Texas. And I acknowledge the harm that happened to these people as the United States was colonized. And I acknowledge that this meant that their families were separated and people lost their lives and land was stolen from them. In addition to being on land that is stolen, I am on land that is built with stolen labor. I live very close to the largest plantation site in North Texas, and I'm descended from enslaved people on both sides of my family. And so I'm very aware of the harm that happened to my family and to other families like mine because of this harm of stealing land and stealing labor that birthed this country. This land acknowledgement is a global practice that started in New Zealand, where they acknowledge the land, the rivers, and the people whenever they gather. And we believe it's an example of the work that we do, where we are attempting to restore that which is broken between us. And practicing repair requires that you first start with acknowledgement and then think about what is your responsibility for accountability and repair. I'm sharing a QR code which will take you to a site just if you want to learn more about this afterwards. It is a site that's updated regularly that has around the globe the Indigenous communities that were here before, the treaties that were made with them, and you can do research. It connects also to the local Indigenous tribes. And so if you want to connect to learn more about how you might support the amends part, there's a huge movement for land back in the United States and in North America, and you can do things like pay land rent and things like that to act in solidarity with communities that have been harmed. I do this as an act of solidarity because I want to think about what duty do I have here? Again, my name is Alli Myatt. I'm one of the co-founders of the Equity Practice. I am a Black woman. I grew up in predominantly white communities and grew up going to predominantly white schools and working in predominantly white institutions. And what that has meant for me is that I am acutely aware of the role that my identity has played and what the role of being an other has played for my life outcomes and what can be true for me. And it's these experiences that have driven me to work towards racial equity. At the Equity Practice, we support organizations to infuse principles of liberation and reciprocity into their talent practices so that everyone can thrive. We see this work as restoration. We believe the ways that we do business traditionally have led to harm, and we see this work as a way to repair that harm. And so I really love restorative work that helps people find each other again, to redesign how they want to be together so that everyone can thrive. And so today, I'm going to stop sharing real quick so I can reshare my screen a different way. Sorry, y'all, just for a little bit of a delay. I will reshare in a second. Did it the wrong way. Okay. Maybe? There we go. Okay. Can you still see my screen again?
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Courtney. All right, so for our time together today, last year I wrote an article about liberation. Love liberation, and that's probably why all of you signed up. Today, I'm going to be sharing a little bit of the concepts in that article about how liberation can dramatically transform your workplace. We'll walk through how patterns of oppression and extraction can show up in our talent practices. I'll share some of the liberatory principles that we talk about in that article, as long as antidotes to some of these patterns, and how you can use a framework for change for applying these liberatory principles. We'll save some time at the end for Q&A. If you click on the Q&A button on your Zoom toolbar, you'll be able to add questions, and we'll be monitoring them as we go. And we'll have some time at the end to talk through those together. At the equity practice, we center race, and we'll be doing that in our conversation today. As you have heard me say, we are a racial equity firm. We believe that we cannot disrupt that which we cannot see. So when you practice seeing race and gender and other identities, you start to see patterns. And in those patterns, you'll see that some people are advantaged and some are disadvantaged. And that's something that we're working to disrupt. And we believe you can't disrupt it if you don't look at it. And so we talk about race, and we'll be talking about race today so that we can decenter or disrupt the inequity that happens because of racist systems in our organizations. Our workplaces are inequitable. At least once a week, I see a headline like the ones that you see on your screen now. Reports come out over and over again about people of color, Black people in particular, and women experiencing a less favorable work experience. What this means is these groups are less likely to be hired. They're less likely to be mentored. They're less likely to be promoted, and when they are promoted, it takes them longer and more time. This means they're less likely to stay at our organizations and to thrive. These outcomes adversely affect people of color and women, stealing from their financial wealth and well-being, and it contributes to health issues. There's this concept called weathering, that when you're in a discriminatory work environment, those regular microaggressions, macroaggressions are like little cuts and trauma that actually affects your cells, and it takes years off of your lives. And these inequities keep our organizations from being diverse, from being able to reflect our society. Evidence shows that more diverse teams that look like the people in the community the teams serve perform better than less diverse teams. Inequity and inclusion are like holes in a bucket. You pour diversity into the top of the bucket, and it doesn't stay in there. It falls out or pours out and through those holes of inequity and exclusion. These holes are very harmful, and they are created by our practices. Our everyday work practices, the things that we do to get work done, are the reason for inequity. Traditional business practices are created to extract more value out of workers than is given back to those workers. So over a decade ago, I got an MBA, and whenever you study business, they talk about shareholder value. And it's this idea that you take as much as you can out of the resources in the business, and that some of those resources are people. So businesses are literally set up to extract from people. And that extraction, I believe, is antithetical to concepts like equity, inclusion, and justice. Businesses stay in extractive relationship through a set of oppressive practices. First, domination and subordination create hierarchical systems that, through the illusion of objectivity, this is where the dominant group creates norms and performance archetypes that preference the dominant culture. Resource and power hoarding are practices where the dominant group in power decides who gets power and resources. And these things, this power and resource flow happens both consciously and subconsciously. And by resources, the things that might seem obvious, like money, time, capacity, but also things that are less obvious, like help, right? Like mentorship, comfort. Those are resources too that help us survive and thrive in organizations. And more resources flow to those who are in the in-group. Practices around dividing and conquering. This is about getting people to focus on individualism and individual performance. We know, if you've ever been part of any type of group effort, you know that individuals are rarely singularly responsible for results that you see on a team, yet we reward individuals as if they were. This leads to competition and blocks people from seeing their ability to have collective power and work together. And then finally, a set of practices around coercion and intimidation. This is about fear. A lot of our practices use fear to control people. And you see this in things like up or out systems. These things create scarcity and help people keep people scrambling and participating in these systems because they're scared they're going to lose their jobs if they don't. These extractive practices show up across the talent lifecycle. So what do I mean by talent lifecycle? This is everything that you experience as an employee from the beginning of the first time you're recruited all the way through the end of when you exit. So this is things like recruiting, hiring, how you're onboarded, how performance is managed, everything. And we see extractive practices and outcomes everywhere in the talent lifecycle. I'm going to walk us through a set of examples for each of the 4 different types of oppressive practices that we just talked about. So for domination and subordination, again, this is about creating hierarchical systems of domination and subordination through the illusion of objectivity. This is where the dominant group is using norms and performance archetypes to preference that dominant group. An example shows up in performance management where you have false objective performance management measures. These measures are defined in ways that benefit the dominant group, which can create an illusion of objectivity. For example, in your handbook, you might have something about professionalism, and those professionalism standards are often written to center Caucasians and Western Europeans. For example, I have read handbooks that say things about hair, professional hair, and it centers Caucasian hair or European hair. And so people whose hair grows out of their hair differently, like mine does, our hair is seen as unprofessional. And this is actually not objective, right? This is about advantaging a certain group. And this is why we have things like the Crown Act. You also see it in professional dress, right? You might have heard stories recently for students graduating, how Indigenous students are fighting to be able to wear their regalia to graduation. And this is because often our professional standards are written to around ideas that show up in Western European ways of dressing. And so if you dress differently, if formal attire looks differently, you may be disadvantaged in these systems. Another example shows up in selection and hiring, which is the myth of the dichotomy of quality and diversity. Research shows that bias that hiring managers have, that they believe that people with marginalized identities are not as qualified as those in the dominant culture. For example, there was a study where they took a fake cover letter and they planted a set of 8 mistakes. And they made one version look like it came from a white man and the other version looked like it came from a Black man. In the cover letter, there were 8 mistakes. And so on average, reviewers found 36% of the mistakes in the white man's cover letter. In the Black man's cover letter, they found 80% of the mistakes. The same mistakes were in both. The performance was the same, yet reviewers found twice as many mistakes in the Black man's cover letter. Again, performance is the same, but perception of the performance is different, and you may wonder why. When reviewing the white man's cover letter, reviewers would hit a mistake, dismiss it, and keep going. With the Black man's cover letter, reviewers would hit a mistake, stop, go back to the top, and review the cover letter more slowly. This is called hypersurveillance, and it's a phenomenon that particularly affects Black employees, but all employees of color across the talent life cycle. Performance and potential is perceived lower for these groups, even though performance is the same. And it reinforces this idea of domination and subordination in organizations. For resource and power hoarding, this is where the dominant group in power decides who gets power and resources like time, money, capacity, help, and comfort. And it happens both consciously and subconsciously. An example is insider tips in onboarding. So when you think about if you've ever onboarded and someone takes you under the wing and tells you about the power moves in an organization, they might tell you where to get lunch if you're in person. So research on parochialism shows that people advantage the in-group when providing help, and they are more likely to provide more help to people they think who are in the in-group. In our organizations, people in the dominant culture of an organization are in this in-group. And people that have shared identities of that dominant culture are admitted to the in-group when they start. So help and onboarding shows up in the ways that staff give people insider information informally. And this help is not equally distributed. New employees who are perceived in the in-group or in the out-group are less likely to get this kind of help. And this uneven help adds up. You see it across the talent lifecycle again, and it adds up over time, and it contributes to some of the inequitable outcomes that we see in our organizations and companies. Another example is how help shows up in career advancement. So folks in the in-group are more likely to be mentored and have champions that advocate for their career advancement. And research shows that women and people of color are less likely to be mentored and coached, which contributes to lower and slower promotion rates for these groups compared to men and white people. For divide and conquer, this is where we're focusing on individual performance again, and it leads to competition and blocks people from our collective power. And performance management, this shows up in how we set our goals. Like I was talking about earlier, our individualized goals reinforce individualism, and it prevents people from seeing how their work is connected and interrelated. This separates staff interests from each other, and it contributes to perceived scarcity and winner take all an approach in doing work, which hinders collaboration and performance. Team norms are another example. Team norms are the type of thing that are not usually articulated, and they're often grounded in ways that the dominant group or the in-group prefer to operate. Teams perceive people with marginalized identities as part of the out-group, and they are more likely to be seen as not fitting in, contributing to those with marginalized identities remaining in the out-group. So to illustrate this further, I'll share some findings from a study about how different racial groups think about norms related to interviewing, as whether they should show up as being liked or show up as being seen as competent. So white folks and Asian folks would focus on being liked. They assumed that people thought that they were competent. Whereas Black, Indigenous, and Latina folks in the study focused on demonstrating competency, which totally makes sense to me when you think about some of the data I shared earlier about perceptions about performance, right? People actually are trying to demonstrate their competence because they know that people don't think that they're as competent because of their identity. And this difference about norms and perception and your idea of whether you should focus on being liked or being competent matters. So if white folks are in the dominant group in your organization and they think that people should be focused on being liked, then when people who are focusing on demonstrating competency are doing that, they're going to be perceived as not fitting in. And research shows that people in the outgroup are less likely to get help, and therefore they're less successful in our organizations because of that. Coercion and intimidation, again, is the last area, and this is how fear is used to motivate our staff. These practices are emphasizing scarcity so that the organizations can use fear to control staff, and it has some consequences. These work environments where fear is used are typically psychologically unsafe, which has negative effects on performance, and staff tend to be more myopic and less innovative. Scarcity also means that the people in the in-group are far less likely to help those in the out-group, which is contributing to inequity. An example is in career advancement, those up or out systems that I mentioned, or rank and yank, where the bottom 10% or a limited number of people are able to advance. This keeps people scrambling and thinking about how they can save their jobs and it encourages them to participate in the extractive systems. Another example in progressive discipline is how hypersurveillance causes fear. So if you remember, we talked about how hyper's the example of focusing more on the performance of Black staff in particular and people of color more generally. And this is something that they've done research in hiring and performance management and whatnot, shows up across the talent life cycle. What this means is that hyper-surveilled team members are more likely to experience formalized progressive discipline, which negatively affects their career progression and wealth creation for people of color, women, and people with other marginalized identities. So what do we do about all this, right? We just talked about all these oppressive outcomes, no fun. So we have a framework for change about how we can change this. And it builds on anti-racist frameworks developed by people like Dr. Barbara Love and Bell Hooks and critical race theorists that disrupt racism in our systems and structures. This framework starts with the first step of See It. And this is about increasing our awareness of racism and patterns of oppression in our workplaces. One of the reasons that racial inequity persists is that we've been conditioned to not see it. You've probably heard this metaphor about it's like the air that we breathe. It is everywhere, and it's hard to see the air unless you are in an area where you might be having some air quality issues due to the fires in Canada right now. But it's like the air that we see, or if we were a fish, it's like the water that we swim in. You can't see it because it's everywhere. And so what this step is about building our capacity to see it, because we believe that's the only way to disrupt it. Step 2 is deconstruct it. And so here we're helping people to identify what is causing the inequity, what actions, processes, behaviors, and practices are contributing to what we see, what biases and mindsets are contributing. This step helps people identify the ways that they may be complicit to maintaining racist and oppressive systems at work. And the final step is co-create it. And this is about working together to reimagine how we work together. This step is where we get to use some liberatory principles to disrupt this oppression. And so I'm going to walk us through some of these liberatory principles now. The antidote to oppression and extraction is reciprocity. And so self-determination is an antidote to creating hierarchical systems of domination and subordination. Power sharing is an antidote to hoarding power. Solidarity is an antidote to dividing and conquering. And abundant care is an antidote to coercion and intimidation. And I'll walk us through all 4 of these. So for self-determination, what I'm talking about is when individuals or groups have sovereignty and autonomy to define their own reality. So I shared examples of how archetypes are grounded in dominant culture. Instead of having an archetype that's supposed to apply to all of us, what if we were able to have an archetype that we defined ourselves? And so that's what self-determination is. It's about honoring the sovereignty and how we all show up in our workplaces. Power sharing is about distributing who has control over those resources, right? That time, that money, that capacity, that help and comfort. So finding ways to ensure that everyone that is affected by something is part of the decisions that are related to that thing. Solidarity is about acting to support collective liberation. And so what this means to me is whenever I'm in position and I have power and privilege, I think about how can I use my power and privilege to support everybody? So how do I cede power? So if I am at the top of an organizational hierarchy, how do I take the power out of my hands and cede it so that it can be shared? How do I make sure that advantages like some of the help, the informal help that we talked about, how can I formalize that so that everyone has access to that kind of help? These are the types of things and actions that are about acting in solidarity with other people and what they might need to be able to thrive. And then finally, abundant care. So these are practices of community care and giving generously to provide shelter, comfort, resources, and rest to members of the community. And this shows up in things of like how people are paid. Do you pay people generously for their labor? Do you ensure that your economic models allow for rest? How do you think about benefits? How do you think about caring for people? This is about centering our humanity in what we provide to people, what resources we provide to people, and how we care for each other. How do you think about bereavement care, right? I read a post recently about someone that experienced a loss, and it was pretty intense that affected their medical health, and they were going to be suffering from it for 2 weeks. And they got 2 days off for bereavement for that instance. Is that abundant care? It doesn't seem abundant to me. And what would it look like if we worked in a place that was invested in reciprocity and not extracting from people, and instead treated people with abundant care? So what does this look like in action? I'll walk you through an example of career advancement. So we'll use the framework for change, the see it, deconstruct it, co-create it, of how we can see what patterns are showing up in the practice and then how we might change that. So see it. So here we're looking at what do the outcomes show us? So you might look at an organization and you see people of color and women take more time to be promoted and are less likely to be promoted than white people and men in this organization. And if you see this, it is aligned to almost every national study, at least in the US, that you will see about promotions and career advancement along lines of race and gender. So deconstruct it. Here we're looking for what's going on. What is the process? So we're pulling across the process and looking at the steps that go into career advancements. So in promotions, you might find that managers identify people to be considered for promotions. And then the next step is the leadership team meets with managers to determine who might be promoted. This process that you see here is simplified, but I was recently looking back on my notes, looking for a resource about promotions, and this was the process we used. And so when you look at this, you might be like, what's wrong with that, right? The issues are the small group of people, and if you think about our organizations, even when there is some level of diversity, the folks who have positional power tend to be part of the dominant culture as constructed or as intended when we look at those patterns of domination and subordination. So our managers tend to be part of the dominant culture. And we just learned that when you think about who they see as performing well and having potential, they see through the lens of identity. So they're more likely to see that men are promotion ready. There's been studies about that. People see more potential of men than they do of women and people of color. They are going to even perceive performance differently. So who's up for promotion is affected by that bias. And then when you see who's making the decision, it's the leadership team. Again, this small group of people who are in the dominant culture, who have been conditioned to see performance and potential of those who are not in the in-group as less than. So those folks are not going to be promoted. So what could we do instead? So for co-created, we would use our liberatory principles to reimagine. So self-determination. What if, instead of relying on only the manager's point of view, we listened to everyone and we had structures and systems in place to help people nominate themselves and advocate for themselves and put themselves up for promotion? What if for power sharing, instead of only having the leadership team weigh in, we thought about how can we share power? Because when you think about who's promoted in our organization, that affects all of us, right? If you've ever had someone who was a great individual contributor be promoted to be your manager and they were a horrible manager, you can think about why these promotion decisions matter, right? and why you want to make sure you're hearing the voices of everyone and how this decision about who's promoted into different roles might affect different people. Solidarity. So I like to think about this help that we talked about, this informal help, as an advantage, and how do we spread that advantage to everyone? So we're not going to get rid of informal help, that's not going away, but how can we create systems and practices that allow people to have access to that advantage? Because the help helps, right? These advantages help people thrive at work. Having a mentor and a champion helps you get promoted. So how do we put formal structures in place that make sure that people have champions and mentors? And then finally, abundant care, an example could be making sure that we budget so that there's not scarcity in promotions, that we are having more generous assumptions about who's going to be promoted and when. Some tips before we head into Q&A to think about across the model. For See It, it's really important to invest in building your team's capacity here. This is not done by a 2-hour training, right? Like if you've seen some of the articles about whether or not DEI is successful in our workplaces, it talks about how a lot of these trainings are ineffective, but then when you look at what people are actually doing, they might have one session on what a microaggression is. That's not enough. Because it's the air that we breathe, or like the water that the fish swim in, we have to build our ability to see it. And so building in time to be able to see these patterns and regularly reflect on them, and having tools that builds your team shared vocabulary and an understanding about what you're seeing is really important. You can use things like, if you've read the Tima Okun piece about white supremacy culture in our organizations, Dr. Bailey Jackson has a great piece about multicultural organizational development, which is another tool to build shared understanding. Dr. Barbara Love's article about developing critical liberatory consciousness is another example. All of these articles have terminology that allows us to make meaning about what we're seeing in our organizations, and using tools, even like the article that I wrote last year, can help organization to help your team to make meaning together so that you can disrupt what's happening. For Deconstructed, similarly, practicing analyzing these patterns. Again, not one or done, but how can you create opportunities for regular reflection with these tools? So at my last organization, we used a version of the Tima Okun piece to help us to see how white supremacy culture, which is one form of oppression, shows up in our organizations. And we actually had rituals at the beginning of meetings and check-ins to reflect on what we were seeing. And what that did is it helped build the muscle to not only see what was happening, but to start to analyze what was going on. Because with that, you need that analysis to determine what steps you want to take to address it. For co-created, I think this idea of being invested in and committed to reciprocity is incredibly important. Liberation for me is about that sovereignty, that freedom, that idea of self-determination and care at work. But really, for me, it's a lot about autonomy and being able to just be my wacky, weird self. And I think that, and operate in ways that are counter sometimes to the archetypes that we've been taught are the right ways of doing things. That's part of being liberated at work for me. And oftentimes, I think you can't be free at work by yourself. Because when we're at work, we're existing in the environment that we create for each other. And so you have to be committed and invested in the freedom of the other person to be their wacky, weird self too. And I think that means that you realize I can't extract from you, because I can't be free if you're not free. And if I'm in an extractive relationship and we're having these oppressive actions that we just talked about, if those are happening between us, then I'm affecting your ability to be free. And that means I can't be free. And so if you really want to think about how you might have a more liberatory workplace, you have to be invested in the humanity of the other people at work. And then finally, I think that accountability is a really important part of this work with love and psychological safety. One thing that I've learned is because I'm unlearning this stuff, it's a long journey, and it means that sometimes I'm going to mess up, right? And I need to be accountable for that and be willing. And sometimes the things that you design won't get you there, right? Like when at my last organization, when we redesigned how promotions were decided, we were iterating. I think we had gone through 3 iterations before I left. And so each time got better, but sometimes you're not going to quite hit it. And so being open to sometimes being wrong and learning and continuing to practice is incredibly important. And I think having an environment where people know that people are accountable for the environment that they create for each other is incredibly important if you want to operate in a more liberatory way. So that is it. Thank you for listening so far. And so now we'll open it up for questions. I know that there's at least one question in here, but you can just click on the Q&A and submit your questions, and then we'll read them out loud. And if we have a particularly juicy one, we might invite you to come up and join me in conversation. So Courtney, what do you see? I'm afraid to click on the Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Alli, so much for taking us through that. We did have one question about the study that we were referencing on being liked and being competent across racial identities. And I believe that's the Stanford Social Innovation Review article on the bias of professionalism standards, which I can drop in here. But
yes, that's definitely one of many studies.
Yes.
For sure. Thanks for that question. Any other questions or ideas that you're playing around with as you think about using these liberatory practices in your organization? I see another one. I'm afraid to click. I feel like my screen will get all.
They're starting to roll in. Give me 1 second to read here. How do you design systems and lead teams in implementing learning and development that focuses on continuous development that centers racial equity?
So how do you say it again, Courtney? Sorry. I wish I could click on it.
Juicy one. How do you design systems and lead teams in implementing learning and development that focuses on continuous development that centers racial equity?
Got it. I think starting with what are the competencies that you want people to demonstrate in your organization? I mentioned the framework from Dr. Bailey Jackson. That's the multicultural organizational development framework. And what that articulates is how organizations evolve from being an exclusionary one to being one that is anti-oppressive and anti-racist. And when you look at what happens is often people first focus on diversifying the team. Then they realize, oh gosh, if we just bring in different people, they're not staying. So then they focus on inclusion and belonging. And then they're like, oh, it's not just about how people feel. There's actually things that we're doing that is actually contributing to inequity. And so then they're like, oh, I guess we should hold ourselves accountable to equity and whatnot. And so there's no right or wrong place of where you are in the journey. It's just like what staff competencies need to be true to support you where you are in the journey and where you intend to be. Because I think when some people say diversity, equity, inclusion, they mean that first thing. They're just about adding new people into the mix. And some of us are talking about liberation and anti-oppression, right? And figuring out what it is, like where you are, what you're trying to accomplish, and then being really clear about what staff need to demonstrate to be able to live into that model. And then I think scaffolding out, like doing regular assessments of like how people are doing on those. That's about that accountability, right? Whatever the competencies are that you have defined for your organization, training people on that, and then making sure people are actually demonstrating that, whether that's in your performance management system and how people are being assessed, I think is important. But making sure that I like to, like when I was doing this in organizations and the way that we try to get organizations to do it is to think about a longer term arc of what are the developmental opportunities that someone might have over the course of the year? How are they scaffolded? And how do you revisit that throughout the year? What sequence do you have? How frequently do you have it? Are some of the things that I tend to think that you should think about. Hopefully I answered that. If I didn't, please add another question. But Courtney, what's up next?
Thanks, Alli. We've got lots of questions in and we may not get to all of them, but I will keep us moving. So there was a question from a person who identifies as a white woman, an operations professional, who's realizing that and continuing to learn that a lot of the traditional ways of working that we've been taught she's starting to learn that they're oppressive, right? Being super data driven, strict about timeline, deadlines, written word, all of that good stuff. And the question is, do you have recommendations for sitting in this operations space as a white person to help create more liberation in the workplace when workplaces often operate in, quote, white ways?
Yeah, it's a great question. The thing I'm going to answer a different part of the question because I think I love the Tema Okun piece because it was super helpful for me. And for those of you who are not familiar, Tema Okun, it's TEMA. OQOK. And she has this website about how white supremacy culture shows up in white collar work, basically. But it's not about whiteness per se, and it's not always about the thing. So using the deadlines, for example, deadlines are not, so she talks about how urgency or false sense of urgency is a tool of oppression. And think about these ways of working as how we center and advantage whiteness in our organizations. And so a deadline in and of itself is not bad. It's how the deadline is set and who that deadline advantages, right? So if the deadline, because a deadline is an agreement that we have about how we're going to get the work done, right? If we have a contract and we're delivering a contract and the contract ends on June 30th, then we might need to have some milestones. And if we're working together on that contract, we might need to work together to complete the contract on time, right? And so a deadline is an agreement between us. But if that agreement was made by only the leadership team and they don't care that the only way I can meet those milestones is to overwork and over labor, or they don't actually hear the voices of people that say, actually, if we try and deliver this contract, this community, this Black community might be harmed if we do it this fast because we won't be able to hear from them if we hit this deadline. If you ignore that kind of stuff, that's when white supremacy culture is at play. So it's not just the thing. It's not just the deadline. It's not just the written word. It's okay to write down things. I've got a deck. There's a whole lot of words on my deck. It's not about the written word. It's about who's advantaged by that and who's not, right? It's about if I articulate my ideas differently than the written word, and people of color sometimes don't use as much of the written word, but our performance management only gives privilege and advantage when I use the written word. And so therefore the people in the dominant culture benefit. So it's important to add that second layer to these things as we think about that. And so the thing that has been helpful for me to get to your question is to slow down. Oh, shoot. Sorry, y'all. To slow down everything. If you can just slow down and reflect on what we were talking about, this idea of who's advantaged, who are we not listening to, who are we listening to, then that's a way to get out what you're talking about, I think. And again, if I didn't get at it, add it to the question, Q&A. Thanks, Courtney. I'm taking a long time to answer these. Sorry.
Oh, no, that's great. Thank you, Alli. We have another question about, can you give more examples about how you think about incorporating liberatory principles in performance management?
Sure. And preview, we actually have an intensive coming up where we'll use case studies to do just that, to look at performance management specifically. But I think that's hard to answer because it's like there's the ways that where goals are set. There's the ways that performance is evaluated, all of those things. If you have a more specific question, that might help me give you more examples. But yeah, there's a lot in performance management because it's goal setting, it's how performance is managed, it's work planning, it's all of the things that go into managing and evaluating performance. Sorry to punt it, but I'm going to punt it.
I love the preview of what's coming. Yes, we have lots of deep dives into lots of areas, so more to come on that. One question from the Q&A is around, can you share examples of how to embed these practices when an organization might be experiencing a layoff? Very pertinent question right now with all that's happening in the world.
Yeah, first, if you're in the middle of a layoff, I think starting with care for your team is most important. Going through a layoff is one of the hardest things studied, like it's one of the hardest things that someone can go through. So I think giving your team the space to go through that is really important. I personally don't think it's a good idea to try and learn when people are in their fight, flight, freeze, or fawn space. So if you're in the middle of a layoff, you do need to do some work, especially for the team that stays, to make them feel safe. There's an organization called the Neuro Leadership Institute, and they have this model called SCARF, which is about the things that can happen at work that trigger fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And SCARF stands for status, so how much power you have, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, so whether I'm in the in group or out group, and fairness. And if you think about a layoff, it hits on all of those things. So you need to help people feel safe again. And then people can be in a place where they can learn some of these practices. But I do think we often, when something like this happens, like something harmful happens, we want to skip the grief and lament part of that. And you can't skip it. You can't skip it. If you've ever read The Body Keeps Score, it talks about if we don't process our emotions, it shows up physically in our bodies. So if you don't give people the space to process their grief in a layoff, then it gets stuck and it's hard to do what we're talking about. So that would be my first advice there.
Thank you, Alli. And then how can people learn more about these deep dives?
I can go through them now, and then if we have more time, we can maybe answer more of them. I want to make sure that my screen is being shared. I just switched slides. Okay, great. Sometimes Zoom is not my friend. So we have 6 intensives coming up for more practice. We use these tools in our manager series, and we often use them in sessions. And these intensives are some of people's favorites of our trainings that we do. So we have some case studies of real life examples of real things that are happening in organizations that make some of this deconstruction work more practical. And what does it mean to take some of these principles and apply them so that you can reimagine the work? And so we have 6 of them coming up in 2023. So recruitment and hiring will be happening June 28th, end of this month. Onboarding in August. Performance management will be in September. We'll have one on career development in October, compensation in November, and then finally progressive discipline in December. And here is a QR code and link at the bottom if you want to find out more and how you can enroll in our intensives. We hope you will join them. They are super fun. There's competition for those of you who like competition, but it's just a great idea. I love playing with these ideas because it's a great way to learn, I think, with play and practice. And so it's just a way to play and practice with these concepts. So thanks for asking. And Courtney, I think we probably have time for a couple more questions.
Yes. So one person asked if we will have another manager series this fall, winter, and I can put a link to our waitlist in the chat for us here for that one. So give me just a second and I'll find that and drop it in. Then one person asked, could you speak more to your earlier comment about setting individual goals versus team and department goals? Do you see a world where individual goals could be liberatory and in support of the team goal?
I think one thing is anything can be liberatory. It just depends on how you do them. There's a lot of research, though, about goal setting that talks about the ways that you can, if you set them the way they're traditionally set, they often make people's view very narrow and myopic because they're so focused on hitting the goal. One way around it is to set this thing called learning goals, especially if your traditional goals work if something is really defined. If you're making a widget and you know how to make the widget and the step to make the widget is very clear, then the traditional ways that we set goals is great for that because I'm going to make 10 widgets in an hour. If it's not well defined and it's more knowledge work, then setting something like a learning goal is more effective and I think more liberatory because it's about what are you learning as you do the work, which to me feels more liberatory and is in more support of being more about psychological safety and making mistakes and things like that. I think the more you can think about things like growth mindset and psychological safety and not using goals in a way that's about control and fear and who gets resources and who doesn't, but really goals are best used to monitor the work, right? We're trying to get that thing done on June 30th. How's it going? What adjustments do we need to make? Not are you good or bad? And anytime you're using goals that's you're good, you're bad, you're going to have some funkiness showing up. It doesn't actually serve the work well when you look at the research. So hopefully that answered your question, but I think like changing your whole mindset about what's the purpose of the goal and what are you actually trying to do? Are you trying to control people and make winners or losers? And why are you doing that? What's that about? Does that actually help you accomplish what you're trying to accomplish? So starting there might be good. Courtney, do we have time for one more?
Yeah. So there's a question around how do you think about hierarchy in this context? What is its role and what org structures do you favor?
Oh gosh, woo! I don't know if that's a 2-minute question. I'm of the mind that there's no right or wrong answer. Hierarchy and power in and of themselves are not bad or good. It's how they're used and who is advantaged and disadvantaged that matters. I was reading a book about restorative work where the author was she was visiting an Indigenous community and they were moving through their community in a line. They were moving from point A to point B. And the position of people in the line mattered. And so she was confused. She's, why are all the women behind the chief who was a man? Like, why is it like that? And they were confused by her question. They're like, what do you mean? And she said, why is that person first and they're more important? And they said to her, it's interesting to me that you think that the person who is first is more important. We don't think about it like that. So I think the ways that we do hierarchy is harmful in that who's more important and who's advantaged is layered on top of it. And that's how oppression shows up. So if you can remove that, because there's different roles that we all need to have, right? Like a manager providing coaching or like coordinating across different people is a task that is needed to happen. It doesn't have to be done oppressively and in ways where power is hoarded. That's not required. So I think you can use a lot of different models. It's just about like, how does power move? And I think the hardest part about that, regardless if you're in a holacracy or traditional hierarchy or a sociocracy, there's tons of different models out there, or teal, right? The hard part is unlearning the stuff that causes us to do the power hoarding, right? Unlearning the things that cause us to wield power oppressively, and unlearning the ways that we might behave that subjugate ourselves to that power. So I think that has to, no matter what your structure is, because these are new ways of working for most of us, making sure you're coupling the structures and systems with that work to help people unlearn things and practice and be accountable when they mess up is critical. Thank you all for staying with us with this hour. Hopefully this was helpful to you. I love talking about this stuff. I really hope you'll sign up for some of our intensives. I think it will be lots of fun. And sign up for a wait list, sign up for a mailing list. We're hoping to do more things like this in the future. So thank you for your time today. And hopefully we'll see you online or even in person, maybe in the future. So thank you so much.